Welcome to episode 2 of the Baby Plato podcast. I'm your host, Josh. Last episode, we talked about the meaning of life, and this episode will be about death. Joining me again is musician and philosopher, Mike.
What's up?
Death. What are your feelings? What are your thoughts, etc., etc.?
Death. Man, what a topic.
Yeah.
I think death is at least recently, has become one of the most intriguing concepts I've ever thought about.
Mm-hmm.
Death. It's such a hard thing to grasp because all we know of is being alive, and I think death is something that we shouldn't be afraid of. But I think it's a natural instinct to be afraid of it. I think it shouldn't be something to be feared because, kind of like what the philosopher Lucretius said, why fear something that's inevitable? It's something that we're all going to have to face eventually at one point. It happens throughout our lives with people that we know. And I think the more we try to deal with it versus running away from it, the better we will be off as a civilization, as people in general. How about you? What's your thought?
Well, I think death is a lot like before you were born. They're kind of like the same thing. You don't really exist, but then after you die, you kind of also don't exist because the self is more like in the consciousness of a person, right? So I think death is very similar to being before you were born, but at the same time, that doesn't really, for some people, it comforts them to know that, it'll just be like how I am, how I was before I existed.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it's still, death is still a little frightening.
For sure.
Even though I recognize that it's we'll be in the same state as we were before we were born.
It's still very scary to think about not existing anymore, especially for the idea of eternity. I'm never going to be alive forever again. That's a very scary feeling. But I think one thing that I find comfort in is the idea of, you won't be alive, assuming that there's no afterlife. You won't be conscious for the rest of eternity. The thing is, when you're dead, you won't feel eternity.
Mm-hmm.
You won't be like, oh man, I wish I was still alive. You're not gonna miss being alive. If you look at the history of the universe, how long is it believed that the universe existed for? Since the Big Bang, we could say over 14 billion years. So within that 14 billion years, 14.7 billion years or something, up till now, at the point where we're alive right now, we didn't feel that 14 billion years, It's not like when the Big Bang happened, we're like, oh man, we have to wait 14 billion years to be alive now. You're just not going to feel it. There's no sensory perception of that time frame, and there's not going to be any sensory perception after you're dead. So it's kind of you'll be dead, it'll suck, you won't be able to, experience life, but you won't feel that lack of life, because you'll be dead. And so in a sense, it's not so bad because you basically just won't know that you're dead. You'll just be dead. And that kind of made me think of death as a very natural and, in a sense, the ultimate neutralizer and equalizer. And what I mean by that is you no longer can feel happiness nor sadness when you're dead. And as people living, I think we experience happiness, sadness, and various emotions in between. But even though we experience these things, it's usually on one side or the other. And so, if we're afraid of death, that's probably because we're more on the happier side, which is good. It means we have a good life. It's natural to be afraid of death for that reason. But when you die, you also can no longer experience sadness and pain and suffering. So in a sense, death is the ultimate neutralizer, where you'll be 100% in the middle, where you can't feel either pain or happiness. So in a sense, yeah, it'll suck, but there's two sides to it, right? There's also that benefit of never having to feel depressed, which might sound kind of dark, but I also think it's kind of, it kind of just goes down to like balance. What do you find fearful about death?
I think for me, death is the most unknown thing.
Right.
Right? Like, that is basically what it comes down to, is that it's the fear of the unknown, and I guess that's basically the fear of everything else, but with death, there is no one who's ever actually come back from it. Like, sure, you could have, like, I think there's two different kinds of death, medically. There's, like, brain death, and there's no coming back from that, and then there's, like, the death of your heart and, like, your system and stuff, or, like, maybe your heart stops beating, but your brain still has, like, oxygen and stuff like that. So there are those who have come back from one type of death, but then there's also brain death, where their brain didn't get enough oxygen, and no one's come back from that.
Right.
So I think it's just the unknown of death that really scares me and a lot of people as well. And it's also the fact that everything I know and everything that is known is consciousness, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Like, that is the only thing that is known to you and to me and to everyone else. Right?
Yeah, so the thought of not being conscious anymore, all of a sudden, I don't know, it is scary. And I used to be really afraid. Like, I don't want to use the word afraid, but I used to like get a really sickening feeling when I think about death. And I have thought about it a lot, just as like a concept. And I think the more I think about it, the more comfortable I am with it. So it's kind of interesting because you say the unknown about what happens when you die. I would almost argue that, at least right now in this point of time, it's more unknown about like why there is consciousness at all. Because when we do look at the universe, there's more unlife versus life. If there were more life versus unlife, or lack of life, we would find life almost everywhere. But we can definitely say that life is more rare than there being no life in the universe. And so the question of like why, I mean, like, we know the processes of evolution, but more for like consciousness, how, like, to me that's more unknown than simply not existing. So, and it kind of boils down to kind of what we talked about last episode about meaning, because, and this is why death intrigues me so much, because it can be used to justify basically living your life to the fullest, appreciating every breath that you take, or like doing crazy shit with no reason and like being an asshole to everyone. You know what I mean? Like, you can say, we're all gonna die anyways, why not do all these stupid things? But you can also say, because we're gonna die, I want to live my life to the fullest. And I want to experience everything to the fullest. Because I do think our acknowledgement of death definitely gives, and also the belief that there is no afterlife, I think gives our life a spark that you can't get anywhere else. And ever since I adapted that view, just everything, like, even when I'm drinking water or like walking outside and breathing the fresh air, I kind of just feel like I appreciate everything on a different level because I know my time is limited.
So I suppose that, yes, there is goodness to life, but at the same time, there is also a lot of badness to life, correct?
Yes.
So
For sure.
What about those that don't enjoy life for one reason or the other? Right? Like, you think that sometimes death is the right thing? Like for those who have maybe terminal illness, or maybe those who are in constant pain because of some reason.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there's many different points one can bring up. Like, for example, when someone is experiencing very large amounts of pain and suffering and sadness, for whatever reason. Not saying that they should commit suicide, but from a totally, I guess, like, objective point of view, death would relieve you from that pain. And so that kind of just goes down to the person. And I think it was the philosopher Albert Camus who brought up the question of, the only philosophical question people should be asking themselves is suicide. That should be or at least that's the underlying principle under everyone's lives. And that kind of makes you think about not only about meaning, but are you happy in your life? What's the state of basically your life? And whether or not you continue living is based off of this question of suicide. And I think that makes you reflect on, does the good outweigh the bad? Suicide is a very, very interesting topic because as a philosopher and as many other people who philosophizes, they might say that, okay, even though I'm like, just taking an example, say they're feeling a lot of physical pain, or maybe their whole body is like destabilized. I would probably argue, and I think a lot of philosophers would also argue, that as long as they still have their mind and they can still think about things, life is still worth living. Even if, like, that's all they can do. So in a sense, whether or not one has meaning in their life and whether or not one should kill themselves. So even if there is more bad than good in their lives, it's still, it's not a black and white answer as to whether or not death is actually the right decision.
I guess that goes back to the whole, you'll be feeling nothing for eternity, and you've felt nothing from before. So maybe it's kind of worth it to stick around even though you're feeling this pain.
Exactly.
Because you won't feel anything after death.
Yeah, and that relates to the point we talked about us existing instead of other people. So basically, the fact that we even got to live in the first place is already a gift. And in that sense, if we're gonna die anyways, why commit suicide? You might as well live for the length that you're here. Because that suicide is just cutting your life short, which inevitably is going to end anyways. But because it's going to end anyways, you might as well just live it. Like, if you really desire death, I mean, if you are experiencing such great levels of unhappiness and pain, then, maybe death sooner is better, but death is going to come no matter what. So, I don't know, to me, that's why I think with that point of view, it's really hard to justify suicide, because we're going to die anyways, so you might as well just keep living. You might as well just, even if you are experiencing sadness, you can at least experience life, while all these potential people in the world couldn't even experience life in the first place. So, yeah, that's kind of what I think about whether or not one should commit suicide, even if there is sadness in their life. I think it wouldn't hurt to just keep living, especially since the only way to have the possibility of happiness is to keep living. Again, death to me is like the ultimate neutralizer. So, yeah, death would relieve you from the pain and the sadness that you're living, but it'll also stop you from the possible happiness that you could be having. And so, in that sense, why not keep living when you've been lucky enough to win the lottery of life, right?
All right, so are there any last thoughts, any last things you want to say about death?
Well, the biggest, most important thing I would say is just don't run away from it. I know it's scary and it's very unnatural. Like, it's very natural to be afraid of it.
Like, even just from an evolutionary standpoint.
Even from an evolutionary standpoint, but as nihilistic as it sounds, death is kind of like the only thing we can be certain of. So, like, maybe other than our own consciousness, but I think the more we run away from it, the worse we are, because we are going to have to face it no matter what.
And I guess by face it, it's not really like, oh, stare at that train while it's coming to you on the tracks. It's more like, don't avoid thinking about it. Right?
Don't avoid, exactly, yeah. Don't avoid thinking about it, and like what I mean is, if we do live our full lives, where we become really old, we're going to be on that deathbed, and we know that death will be approaching any time.
Or even before our old age.
Or, I mean, yeah, who knows what the circumstances are, but there will be a point where we're going to have to face it head on, and I think the more we deal with it throughout our lives, the better we'll be when that point comes. And I think a lot of people who spent their whole lives running away from it, when they reach a point in their life when they do have to face it, you can't handle it, because you're like, I spent my whole life, trying to believe that it's not real. But so I think the best thing to do is really just kind of accept it and then live life accordingly, because you're going to die. What things are you going to do differently, as opposed to trying to believe that it doesn't exist? I think that would lead to a more fruitful life. And I think as a civilization, we'll also be better off, as opposed to doing things that you would only do if you could live forever. So yeah, we're all gonna die. Yay, fun.
Thanks to Mike for joining me on the second episode of the Baby Plato podcast. As last week, all the music you heard was by him. And as usual, if you have any feedback, you feel free to email me at babyplatopodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on wherever you found this, and hopefully I'll get back to you.